Race relations in the university in 2011. Why I chose the topic of race relations, because I believe that it affects every part of your life, and especially education. In this segment, I will cover three main points: slavery of the African American people, their segregation and denial of equal education under segregation and Jim Crow laws, and the current educational environment circa 40 years after the assassination of MLK. At this point, we will talk about how in 1870s, in the 1880s, there was a circumstances common to Americans where they enjoyed the spectacle of what we call lynching. Lynching comes from Charles Lynch, who was a vigilante in the 1800s, who had a spectacular way of punishing blacks, which was hanging them from a tree, any available tree, for any reason at all. This policy also went to burn blacks, especially black men. But lynching was not a male only, a woman only, or child only phenomenon, or a black only, because the statistics say that there were 4,743 lynchings from 1888 to 1968, and that 3,446 of them were black. Lynching was a way to control the African American people. Another way to control them was through education, denial of education. This Jim Crow law kept blacks out of schools, got schools burnt, churches burnt. But this was eventually halted under Brown versus Board of Education. In Brown versus Board of Education, it was ruled that the separate but equal policy was unconstitutional and therefore should not be allowed in the context of keeping African Americans from an education that is equal to the education of Caucasian Americans. This separate but equal policy is noted on blackpast.org, where Scott and Dorothy Bullitt of Washington University warn and talk of how this policy almost denigrated the black society, how slavery and lynching kept the population totally separated from white population, only in the form of master to slave or worker to overseer. And I would like to cite withoutsanctuary.org for providing the statistics on lynching. In Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled that Jim Crow no longer takes effect. But the Brown versus Board of Education was not affected until the mid to late 1960s, after the 1964 Civil Rights Act was implemented by Lyndon Johnson. The assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968 citing the Associations for Study of African American History and Life, began a process which propelled forward the end of segregation, which was banned under the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education Act. And still in the 1960s, blacks still were not going to the same educations as getting the same education as white in the South. After the 1970s, we see no more segregation in all the major capitals. It's only in a few small southern pockets. And now we have our first statistics for African American education. The National Center for the Education Statistics show that in 1980 there were 2 times as many of whites versus blacks graduating from college. That there was twice as many as whites as blacks, and that's 42% versus 21% attending college. And a surprising number is that blacks and whites are almost equal in getting the high school diploma or GED at 88%. Less than 2% of all black males get a master's or above, while only 8.9% of white males get a master's. Now for the statistics for our class. There were 4 white males, 4 white females, 2 black males, 1 black female, and 1 Pacific Islander and 1 Asian. 70% of you have lived somewhere else besides Kansas City. 90% believe that race has no barrier in education. 95% have an education, believe that education has no barrier to race. In conclusion, Dr. Kling's dream has come true.